My wife said to me, I'm going to spend a wild night with David. I want to feel alive again, feel what it's like with someone else, like a real woman. In rage, I said, what the heck are you talking about? You're a married woman, can't you remember? She smirked. No, loser, you don't get it. I want to feel other men's different shapes, sizes and taste them. She crossed the line. I gave her one last chance. Fine, go ahead, but the moment you walk out that door, our marriage is over, don't ever come back. Then she packed her bags and walked out without even looking back. Nathan leaned against the kitchen counter, fingers clutching his coffee mug like it was a lifeline. His eyes stared blankly into the dark liquid, but his mind was far from here, drifting in a haze of unease that had been creeping into his life for months now. The kitchen felt colder than usual, even though the rain outside was soft, barely more than a drizzle. Courtney had been distant, distracted, but nothing prepared him for the storm brewing tonight. The clicking of high heels echoed through the house, snapping him out of his thoughts. He straightened up, turning towards the doorway just as Courtney strutted into the kitchen, her eyes glued to her phone. She didn't acknowledge him at first, too busy scrolling through whatever was consuming her attention. I'm going out tonight, she said, her tone as casual as if she were announcing a grocery run. Nathan blinked, frowning. Out where? She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her lips curled into something Nathan had never seen before, cold and detached. I'm going to spend a wild night with David. David. Nathan's pulse quickened. He knew the name David was the guy from the club, the one Courtney had mentioned once or twice in passing, laughing him off as just someone from work or a friend, but the way she said it now, the way her voice lingered over the name, something wasn't right. Who the hell is David? Nathan demanded, his voice rising slightly, though he struggled to keep it steady. And what do you mean you're spending a wild night with him? Courtney finally looked up from her phone, locking eyes with him. The expression she wore made his skin crawl, a mix of boredom and something darker, like she couldn't even be bothered to care about his reaction. David is someone who makes me feel alive, Nathan, the words hung in the air like a noxious gas. Nathan's mouth went dry. What the fuck are you talking about? You're a married woman, can't you remember? Courtney didn't hesitate. I want to feel like a real woman again, with someone exciting, someone different. I'm tired of this life, tired of you. Nathan could feel the heat rising to his face, the back of his neck growing tight. Are you listening to yourself? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. We've been married for years, you can't just walk out. And I am walking out, she interrupted, her tone icy and final. This marriage has been dead for a long time, Nathan. You're just too pathetic to admit it. His breath hitched. Pathetic? Courtney, we built this life together, we made promises. You can't just throw that away because you want to fling with some random guy. Courtney took a step closer, her face inches from his. Oh, but I can, she whispered, her eyes gleaming with something twisted. You don't get it, loser. I want to feel other men's different shapes, sizes, and tastes. I want something new. You'll never understand that. You could never make me feel the way I want to. Nathan's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He felt the rage building inside him, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. Do you even realize what you're saying? She shrugged, pulling back as if he were nothing more than an obstacle in her path. I'm done explaining myself to you, Courtney, this is insane, he shot back, voice cracking with a mix of anger and desperation. We could talk about this, you don't just walk out on a marriage. You don't just leave everything behind for what, Nathan? For you? She sneered. You're a loser, you're comfortable, predictable. I need something real, something that makes me feel alive again. Nathan stared at her, trying to find the woman he had once known, the woman he had loved, but she was gone. In her place stood a stranger who didn't care about him, about their life together, about anything they had shared. He could feel the final thread of their marriage snapping, tearing away with each venomous word that spilled from her mouth. Fine, he said, his voice low but steady now, the anger settling into something cold and calculated. If you walk out that door tonight, we're done. Don't come back. Courtney paused for a moment, studying him like she was weighing her options. For a brief second, Nathan thought he saw hesitation in her eyes. Maybe there was still a chance, some sliver of humanity left in her that remembered the life they had built together. But then she smirked. You really think I care? I'll do what I want, Nathan, and I won't look back. She turned her back on him and walked down the hall without another word. He listened to the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, each step feeling like a hammer pounding nails into the coffin of their marriage. Nathan stood in the empty kitchen, his hand still gripping the edge of the counter as if holding on for dear life. He heard her moving around upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing, zippers being pulled. She was packing. This was real. Minutes later, the front door slammed shut. Courtney was gone. Nathan didn't move. The house felt impossibly quiet now, the rain outside a distant echo compared to the storm raging inside him. Everything he had known, everything he had built with her over the years, had crumbled in an instant. But it wasn't sadness that overwhelmed him, it wasn't even despair. It was rage, pure burning rage, and for the first time in his life, Nathan felt like he was capable of anything. The first few days after Courtney left were a blur for Nathan. He moved through them mechanically, the routines of his life now empty and meaningless. She didn't call, didn't return, and he didn't reach out. He had no reason to. Courtney had made her choice, and now he was going to make his. Late at night, Nathan sat at his desk, the dimmed light from the monitor casting long shadows in the room. His hand hovered over the mouse before he clicked open a new document. His fingers rested on the keyboard for a moment, his mind racing as he considered what to do next. He could feel the rage boiling inside him, but it wasn't the kind of anger that would make him lash out irrationally. No, he was going to be smart about this. With a deep breath, Nathan began to type. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed with purpose. Names, dates, details. This wasn't just about lashing out, it was about dismantling everything Courtney and David had together, piece by piece. Nathan was a software engineer by trade, a man used to solving problems with precision and logic, and this betrayal was no different. He would treat it like a bug in the system, something to be identified, analyzed, and eradicated. David was the key. Nathan began his research. He found David's last name easily enough. Courtney hadn't bothered to hide it. A quick search revealed his social media profiles, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Everything was out there, laid bare for Nathan to dissect. He clicked through photos of David. The man was tall, athletic, the type of guy who clearly spent time at the gym and probably knew it. There were pictures of him at clubs, surrounded by friends, a drink always in hand, a cocky grin plastered on his face. Nathan studied every detail, noting who David spent time with, where he worked, the type of people he associated with. David worked in real estate. He managed a small but lucrative portfolio of high-end properties in the city. Nathan made a mental note of the firm's name and filed it away for later. His mind was already spinning with ideas. Nathan scrolled further down, finding more personal posts. There were photos of David on vacations, hiking, partying, living a carefree life. And then there was a picture of David and Courtney, standing far too close for comfort. They were at some rooftop bar, glasses raised in a toast, her hand resting lightly on his chest. It was like a punch to the gut. Nathan clicked away from the photo, closing his eyes to steady himself. This wasn't the time for emotions. He needed focus. Revenge was a process, not a burst of anger. He resumed his search, this time diving into David's work connections. A few clicks and he had everything he needed, colleagues, partners, clients. Nathan pulled up public records, finding out where David had invested, which properties he had listed under his name. He made a list of clients he would soon contact, anonymously of course, and set the groundwork for a financial ruin that David would never see coming. But David wasn't the only target. Courtney had made her choice too. She had walked out without a second thought, and Nathan wasn't about to let her off easily. She still had access to their joint accounts, the house, and everything they had built together. He wasn't going to let her take any more from him. Nathan logged into their bank account. He hadn't touched the money yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before she tried. With a few clicks, he transferred everything into a private account under his name. The house was still in both their names, but Nathan had a lawyer ready to start the process of severing her from any financial claims. He opened a new file, this one dedicated to Courtney. He made a list of the things he knew would hurt her the most. First, the money. She had grown accustomed to a comfortable lifestyle, one funded by Nathan's hard work. Taking that away from her would be the first blow. Next, her reputation. Courtney had always cared about appearances, how she looked to her friends, her colleagues, the community. Nathan began drafting anonymous messages, each one designed to slowly dismantle the image she had worked so hard to maintain. It would start with whispers, rumors that would eventually reach the ears of those closest to her. He smiled grimly as he typed. It would all seem so innocent at first, so coincidental. Courtney and David would never know where it came from. He leaned back in his chair, the plan forming clearly in his mind now. It would be slow, methodical, and devastating. Each move would be like a piece of code in a program, executed flawlessly and without error. He wouldn't rush. He would let it unfold naturally, giving them enough time to feel comfortable, to feel like they had won. But they hadn't won, not yet. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind already anticipating the next step. David's real estate career would be the first to fall. Nathan had found several small discrepancies in David's work, nothing major, but enough to make the right people suspicious. A few carefully placed tips to David's clients would lead to questions, investigations, and ultimately a loss of trust. Next would be Courtney. The whispers would grow louder, the rumors spreading. Her friends would start to distance themselves, work colleagues would look at her differently. She'd feel the isolation creeping in, slowly at first, but relentlessly. Nathan opened his calendar, marking the days. This wasn't going to be a quick process. It was going to take time, and patience was something he had plenty of. He logged out of his accounts, shutting down the computer. The room was silent again, the only sound the tick of the clock on the wall. Nathan sat there for a moment, staring at the dark screen, feeling the cold satisfaction of a man who had just set his plan in motion. Courtney and David had no idea what was coming. They thought they had won, that they had escaped without consequences, but they were wrong. Nathan smiled to himself as he stood up and walked out of the room. His revenge had only just begun. Weeks passed, and Nathan watched as his plan started to bear fruit. The first ripples of destruction were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but Nathan knew better. He monitored it all with clinical precision, much like watching code execute without a hitch. David's life began to unravel. First, it started with a few business deals falling through, deals that were supposed to be sure things. Nathan had made sure that a few well-placed anonymous tips reached the right people. These tips hinted at financial irregularities, enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to cause an immediate uproar. At least not yet. In his office, Nathan sat at his computer, staring at a message board frequented by high-end real estate investors. He had posted a few comments under different usernames, subtly seeding doubts about David's integrity. I heard some unsettling things about the guy David Heller. Anyone else having second thoughts? Soon, others chimed in, the snowball had begun to roll, and Nathan knew it was only a matter of time before it gained momentum. A week later, Nathan heard from one of his contacts in the business world, a man who had unknowingly passed on some of Nathan's poisoned information. David's losing clients left and right, his contact mentioned in passing over drinks. Seems like some big scandals are brewing. It's weird though, there's no actual proof, just whispers. Nathan feigned surprise. Really? That's strange. He always seemed so solid. But behind the calm facade, Nathan relished every word. David's reputation was already crumbling, and the beauty of it was that no one could trace it back to him. Meanwhile, Courtney's life had taken a nosedive in a different way. One morning, she logged into her banking app to find their joint account completely empty. Panic surged through her as she stared at the zeros. Her immediate reaction was to call Nathan. He was sitting in his home office, sipping coffee when his phone rang. Seeing her name flash across the screen, he allowed himself a brief smile before answering. Nathan. What the hell? Courtney's voice came through the phone, shrill and frantic. The account's been drained. Where's the money? Nathan leaned back in his chair, playing with his pen. He let her panic fill the silence for a few moments before responding calmly. I'm sorry, Courtney, but I don't owe you anything. You made your choice when you walked out. There was a brief pause on the other end before her voice returned, more furious now. You can't do this. I'm still your wife. Not anymore, Nathan said, his voice colder now. You left, remember? You chose David. I don't owe you a thing. Her breath hitched and for a moment there was silence. Then she hissed, you bastard. Nathan didn't flinch. Goodbye, Courtney. He hung up before she could say anything else, setting the phone down with a sense of finality. This was just the beginning. Across town, Courtney stood in her small apartment, staring at her phone in disbelief. Her hand shook as she tried to process what had just happened. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed Nathan would be hurt, maybe angry, but she never imagined he would go this far. She paced the floor, her mind raced. With no money in the joint account, she couldn't cover the rent for her new place, let alone the lifestyle she'd grown used to. She grabbed her phone and dialed David. He answered after a few rings, sounding distracted. Hey, what's up? David. I need your help, Courtney said, her voice shaking. Nathan drained the account. I have nothing. There was a pause on the other end before David replied, that's messed up. But I've got my own problems right now. What do you mean? Courtney asked, frowning. She hadn't noticed anything off with David recently apart from him being a little distant. My clients are pulling out left and right, he said, frustration clear in his voice. I don't know what's going on but my business is in freefall. Some rumors are going around that I've been involved in illegal stuff but there's no proof. It's like my whole career's being sabotaged. Courtney's heart sank. What are you going to do? I don't know, David muttered. But I can't help you right now, I need to figure out my own situation. Courtney felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. David had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself, but now even he was falling apart. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to scream. Look, David said after a pause, I'll call you later, all right? I need to deal with this. He hung up before she could respond. Courtney stared at her phone feeling utterly abandoned. Her mind swirled with anxiety as she thought about the mounting bills and rent due in a few days, and now David, her supposed escape, was crumbling too. She had no one to turn to. Nathan had cut her off and David was drowning in his own mess. Her thoughts kept returning to Nathan. He had been so cold, so calculated, in their conversation. The man she had once known who had loved her unconditionally was gone. She realized too late that she had underestimated him. Nathan wasn't just angry. He was vengeful. Back in his office, Nathan leaned forward in his chair staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He could almost feel Courtney's desperation through the phone call. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around her and David. He had severed their financial lifeline and David's reputation was already hanging by a thread. Nathan clicked through another file on his desktop labeled Next Steps. There were still more pieces to move, more traps to set. His plan was far from over. He poured himself another cup of coffee savoring the bitter taste as he considered his next move. Courtney and David had made their choices. Now they were going to live with the consequences, and Nathan was going to watch it all unfold. Courtney and David were now sharing a small cramped apartment far from the glamorous future they had envisioned. The weight of their decisions bore down on them with each passing day. David's business, once a promising venture, was crumbling faster than he could salvage it. Courtney, with no access to the funds she had once taken for granted, found herself in a cycle of panic, anger, and regret. One evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, tension in the apartment reached a boiling point. He stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, glaring at David who sat slouched on the couch staring at his phone. What the hell are you doing? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. David didn't look up. Checking my emails. For what? Another client dropping you? Courtney's words were sharp, intended to sting. David's grip tightened around the phone but he didn't respond immediately. He had learned to swallow his frustration with her over the past few weeks but tonight it felt impossible. I'm trying to figure things out, Courtney. Maybe if you could stop nagging for a second I could focus. Courtney laughed, a cold hollow sound. Focus on what? Your career is in the toilet. My life is a disaster. Everything was supposed to be better and now. Her voice broke and in a fit of rage she grabbed a glass from the counter and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, shattering into pieces. Now we're stuck in this mess. David shot up from the couch, his patience finally snapping. What's happening to us? He shouted, his face red with anger. Everything was fine until what? Courtney interrupted, her eyes narrowing. Until I left? Is that what you're going to say? You think this is my fault? David rubbed his temples, pacing back and forth, trying to control his breathing. I don't know, Courtney. Maybe this is karma or something. Maybe we're getting what we deserve. Karma? Courtney scoffed, stepping closer to him, her eyes burning with fury. You're blaming me now? You wanted this just as much as I did. Don't act like I'm the only one who made choices here. David clenched his fists, his voice rising again. I never wanted this. I didn't sign up for losing everything. This was supposed to be a fresh start, not a goddamn nightmare. Courtney's face twisted with frustration. You think I wanted this? She grabbed a nearby lamp, raising it as if to throw it but stopping short. I thought we'd have something better, a life without all this suffocation, but now everything's gone. The money, the stability, everything. David's eyes flared. Well, it's not working, Courtney. Nothing's working anymore. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room in exasperation. I can't close a single deal. My clients are leaving in droves. It's like someone's out to ruin me and I can't figure out why. Courtney threw up her hands in frustration. It's not just you. Do you think it's a coincidence that everything's falling apart for both of us? David stopped pacing, glaring at her. What's that supposed to mean? Courtney's voice softened for a moment, her anger replaced by something close to desperation. I don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just bad luck. Maybe Nathan? David laughed bitterly, cutting her off. Nathan? You think he's behind this? He's a pathetic loser. He doesn't have the guts to do something like this. Doesn't he? Courtney said quietly. The silence that followed hung heavy in the air. Meanwhile, Nathan sat in his office watching the cracks in their relationship grow. He had hired a private investigator weeks ago, and the updates he received were like pieces of a puzzle falling perfectly into place. Every argument, every failure, every moment of despair was another victory for him. He leaned back in his chair reading the latest report. Subject: Courtney Williams has been observed arguing frequently with subject David Heller. Financial strain appears to be worsening, with several outbursts witnessed. Their relationship is deteriorating. Nathan smiled to himself, savoring the slow collapse of their lives. He had meticulously orchestrated every setback. David's business losses, Courtney's financial ruin. He'd ensured that nothing would go their way, and now it was all unraveling. He opened a file on his computer labeled Next Phase. Inside were more pieces of the plan, more ways to push them to their breaking point. He had contacts who could make David's professional life even more difficult, who could spread rumors and sour distrust among his remaining clients. As for Courtney, Nathan had already spread whispers among her social circles, ensuring that her so-called friends would start distancing themselves, questioning her judgment and loyalty. His phone buzzed. It was a text from the private investigator. David hasn't been able to secure any new clients in 2 weeks. Courtney received another notice from the bank today. They're both unraveling. Nathan responded with a simple cold message. Continue watching. The worst is yet to come. Back in the apartment, Courtney sat on the couch staring blankly at the television. The silence between her and David was suffocating. The earlier argument had left heavy tension in the air, but neither of them had energy to continue fighting. David sat across from her, his head in his hands. What are we going to do? Courtney asked softly. Her mind raced, but she didn't have any solutions. She felt trapped, cornered by choices she had made and by life she thought would be better, but now she was beginning to doubt everything. I don't know, she finally whispered. I don't know anymore. David looked at her, his eyes full of uncertainty. Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't have. Don't. Courtney interrupted sharply again. Don't say that. We can't go back. We can't undo this. The room fell silent once more, both sinking into thoughts as weight of their decisions crushed them. Neither realized how carefully their destruction had been planned outside their window. The world carried on, oblivious to storm brewing inside their lives, and Nathan from afar watched with quiet satisfaction as Courtney and David's descent into madness deepened. The night sky roared with thunder as rain lashed against windows of small apartment Courtney and David now called home. Inside, atmosphere was even darker. The once bright spark excitement they shared had long since died, replaced by bitterness, blame, and deep-rooted hatred for one another. Every breath they took seemed fill air with tension, but neither had energy to keep fighting. Courtney sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. The bottle on the table was nearly empty, like their bank accounts. She stared at the liquid as if searching for answers in its depths. David, on the other hand, sat on the worn couch, hunched over with his hands clasped tightly together. His phone had been silent for days, and each passing hour without a call for work only deepened the lines on his face. We can't live like this, Courtney muttered, more to herself than to him. The words hung in the air, unanswered. David remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had nothing left to say. His business was gone, his reputation shattered. He had tried to rebuild after the clients started dropping him, but it was like trying to hold on to sand. Everything slipped through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to grasp it. Now, he was just waiting for the next disaster. The sound of the doorbell startled them both. Courtney shot a glance at David, her eyes filled with unease. Who the hell is that at this hour? David stood slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. He walked toward the door, his steps heavy. When he opened it, the last thing he expected to see was 2 police officers standing in the dim light of the hallway, their faces stern, their uniforms dark and imposing. David Heller? One of them asked, though it was clear they already knew. David swallowed hard, his heart racing. Yeah, that's me. What's going on? The officer held up a piece of paper, his expression unchanged. We have a warrant to search your premises. There have been multiple reports of financial misconduct, embezzlement, and tax evasion. David's face went pale. What? That's impossible. He stepped back, almost tripping over his own feet. There's been some mistake. I haven't done anything like that. The officer didn't respond to his protests, stepping into the apartment with his partner. Courtney, still at the table, stood up quickly, her hand shaking. What's happening? She asked, her voice rising with panic. David turned to her, eyes wide. They're saying I've been involved in embezzlement, Courtney. I didn't do any of this. Courtney's stomach dropped. David, this can't be real. The officers began methodically going through their things, checking paperwork and electronic records. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for, a series of suspicious transactions and altered documents. David could only watch in horror as his world unraveled in front of him. No, this isn't possible, he shouted, trying to explain. Those files, someone must have planted them. I didn't touch any of them. One of the officers looked at him with the same detached professionalism he had from the beginning. You can explain that down at the station. For now, we need you to come with us. Courtney's breath caught in her throat as they moved toward David with handcuffs. Wait, she cried, stepping forward. He didn't do this. He couldn't have. David's voice cracked as they cuffed his wrists. Courtney, I swear, I don't know how this happened, but even as he said the words, doubt began to creep into his mind. Who would do this? How could everything go so wrong so quickly? As the officers led him toward the door, Courtney was frozen in place, her mind reeling. She couldn't lose him now, not after everything they had been through. But there was nothing she could do. In a matter of minutes, David was gone, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of their lives. Meanwhile, Nathan sat in his new home, staring out at the peaceful garden bathed in the moonlight. His phone vibrated on the table beside him. He picked it up, reading the text message from the private investigator. It's done. David's been arrested. Courtney's alone now, no one left. Nathan's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The months of planning, the sleepless nights of plotting, all had led to this. His wife and her lover, reduced to ruins. He had been careful, leaving no trace of his involvement. The false financial records had been easy to plan, especially given his background in software. A few well-placed tips to the authorities, and it was only a matter of time before the house of cards David had built came tumbling down. As for Courtney, she had already lost access to their joint finances, and now with David gone, she would have nothing. Nathan stood up, stretching his arms as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked night. The storm that had raged outside earlier had calmed, leaving behind a quiet, almost serene atmosphere, fitting, he thought, for the end of this chapter. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat back down, savoring the drink. It tasted like victory. For the first time in months, he felt truly free. The anger, the betrayal, the burning need for revenge, all of it had been extinguished. Now, there was only peace. As Nathan finished his drink, he glanced at his phone one last time. There were no more messages to wait for, no more updates to monitor. It was over. David was in a cell, Courtney was alone and broken, and Nathan had walked away from the wreckage without a scratch. He stood up, leaving the empty glass on the table and headed toward the bedroom. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new life, one without the ghosts of his past, and as for Courtney and David, they would live with the consequences of their choices. Their world had been shattered, and Nathan couldn't care less. They were nothing to him now. The final blow had been struck. Nathan had months had passed since the night everything fell apart for Courtney and David, and now Nathan sat on the porch of his new home, cradling a warm cup of coffee in his hands. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon, illuminating the fields that stretched out before him. It was peaceful here, far away from the chaos of the city, far away from the wreckage of his old life. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through him. His mind was clear, a stark contrast to the storm that had once raged inside him. There were no more sleepless nights, no more burning need for revenge. He had done what he needed to do, and now there was nothing left but the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt. The wind rustled gently through the trees, the only sound breaking the morning silence. Nathan smiled to himself, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. His old life, with all its betrayals and bitterness, felt like a distant memory now. Courtney and David were no longer a part of his world, they were mere shadows, fading with each passing day. Nathan had heard through a mutual acquaintance that David was in a lengthy sentence. The embezzlement charges had stuck, and with the damning evidence Nathan had planted, there was no way out for him. David had tried to fight it, of course, pleading innocence, shouting about being framed, but in the end, it didn't matter. The system had swallowed him whole, and now he was just another inmate in a cold, gray prison cell. Courtney, on the other hand, had been left to fend for herself. Nathan didn't bother checking up on her directly, he had no interest in seeing the wreckage up close. But the investigator he had hired occasionally sent updates. She had lost everything, the apartment she had once shared with David was gone, repossessed when they couldn't keep up with the payments. She'd been fired from her job, her reputation tarnished by the scandal surrounding David's arrest. From what Nathan had heard, she was living in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, barely scraping by. Most of her so-called friends had abandoned her once her life fell apart, and now she was truly alone. The thought of it no longer stirred the rage it once had. Nathan felt nothing but a detached sense of justice. He had given her every opportunity to turn back, to reconsider her choices, but she had walked out that door without a second thought. She had betrayed him, and now she was paying the price. As he finished his coffee, Nathan's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, seeing a message from his lawyer. It was a routine update, confirming that the divorce had been finalized without issue. Courtney had tried to contest the settlement at first, but with her financial situation in shambles, she had no real leverage. Nathan had gotten everything, his assets, his peace, his freedom. He set the phone back down and leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. The sun had risen higher now, bathing the porch in a warm golden light. This was what he had wanted all along, not the violence, not the chaos, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only after a storm has passed, when the sky is clear and the world feels new again. Nathan had moved out of the city not long after David's arrest. The house he had bought was smaller, quieter, tucked away in a rural area where he could live without the constant reminder of what had happened here. He didn't have to deal with whispers behind his back, didn't have to worry about running into anyone who knew the old him. This was a fresh start, a chance to build something new without the weight of betrayal hanging over him. As he sat there watching the sun climb higher into the sky, Nathan thought about the future. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel uncertain. He had spent so long consumed by anger, by the need to right the wrongs done to him, that he had forgotten what it felt like to just be, to exist without the constant pull of revenge. He thought about the small garden he had started planning out back, About the books he had begun reading again, little things, simple things, but they brought him a kind of joy he hadn't felt in years. Life was different now, quieter, more grounded, but it was better, stronger. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. They were in town and wanted to catch up over dinner. Nathan smiled as he typed out a quick reply. It would be nice to reconnect with people who hadn't been a part of the turmoil. The storm that had consumed his life had finally passed, leaving behind a calm that felt foreign but welcome. There was no rush anymore, no need to constantly look over his shoulder, no need to plot or plan. His enemies had been dealt with, his old life dismantled piece by piece, and now there was nothing left but to move forward. As he stood up, stretching his arms above his head, Nathan took one last look at the sunrise. The day was still young, full of promise. He stepped off the porch, feeling the soft earth beneath his feet as he made his way toward the garden. There was work to be done, but for the first time in years, it was the kind of work he was happy to do. No more schemes, no more vengeance, just a simple act of living, of finding peace. Finally, he was free.